Hi there. Welcome to Evolution, Biology 3510 at BGSU. My name is Scott Rogers. My office number is 411 in the Life Sciences Building, although currently it's better to contact me through my email, which is down here, srogers@bgsu.edu. Just a few characters that we'll be talking about somewhat. Darwin, of course, started out evolution with natural selection, and then Stephen Gould is very famous for his lectures and books on evolution, as well as his ideas and theories about punctuated evolution, which I'll be talking about. Because I'm a molecular biologist, I'll be talking quite a bit in the course about things that happened in the molecular realm of evolution, starting actually before Watson and Crick, but really being stimulated by the work of Watson and Crick and their solving of the structure of DNA in 1953. So here's just a little information about me. Again, Department of Biological Sciences at BGSU. There's my office and my lab, both in the Life Sciences Building. My phone number is this, although I don't, if you want to leave a message, I'll answer that later. The best way to contact me is by email. My degrees are in molecular biology, and I also deal a lot with molecular evolution, microbes and nucleic acids, both RNA and DNA, in ice, glacial and lake ice. Introns, specifically group 1 introns, nucleic acid preservation, ancient microbes and nucleic acids, and plant development as well. So if you have any questions about any of those areas, I should be able to answer any of your questions. Here's the structure of the class. There will be lectures and activities, and they're all going to be on YouTube. All communication will be via email, unless you have a special request for a WebEx meeting, and just contact me and I'll set one up. Each Friday of the course I'll hand out a quiz, and then you'll have about 24 hours to complete that. You can use videos and any notes that you have to answer those questions. There will be some multiple choice, some short answer, and some probably drawing. The grading then will be 75% on the quizzes, 5 quizzes, and then at the end 1 exam worth 25% of your grade. Over here is the class schedule, the general introduction today. Then I'll talk a bit about SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, the disease. And then I'll talk about the 1918 pandemic and some similarities to the COVID-19. Then the history of the study of evolution, the history after Darwin, dating rocks and fossils, evidence for evolution, some things about early evolution on Earth, and then talk about some of the molecules of life, including DNA, RNA, and proteins. A little bit about general genetics, since that leads to a lot of the analyses of evolution, and then population, genes and populations, gene flow, genetic drift, and then into multi-gene families and multicellularity, including development in animals and development in plants, and then talk about taxonomic distinctions, what is a species, and then natural and sexual selection, adaptation, and then a big section on genomics, talking about what genes organisms have and how the evolution of those genes led to the evolution of those organisms. And then finally, the final lecture is on the evolution of humans. You may have noticed from the schedule that there is no textbook. I've decided to just have the lectures on videos, and then you view the videos. We'll discuss those a bit, and also some of those will be coming through on Top Hat, which is another way of going through these discussions and the lecture and slide materials. Much of the material that I'll be talking about comes from a textbook that I wrote, Integrated Molecular Evolution. It's just about a year old, so it's pretty up to date. It's also the textbook used for my course that I'll be teaching in the spring of 2021, which is Molecular Evolution, which has an undergrad and a grad component, 4480 and 5480. Another book that just came out this year is a popular book or trade book, so it should be readable, approachable by everyone, in Defrosting Ancient Microbes. And so we've been studying microbes and DNA and RNA in ice for many years, from Antarctica, from the Arctic, and from other places. And we've been finding a lot of different organisms in those. And now, as the ice is melting, those microbes are being released into the environment. And so this talks about some of the impacts of that. Evolution means change through time. And initially, billions of years ago, there was chemical evolution, which led to the biological chemicals which were adopted by biological organisms. So this eventually developed into biological evolution, and both of these are intimately related, both in time and in those organisms as well. In 1973, Dobzhansky made the statement that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And this emphasizes the point that if you're studying biology, the only way you can make sense of all of it, that the way that you can unify it, is by considering the evolution of those systems, those molecules, those organisms. In 1996, Ridley also made a statement that is similar. The theory of evolution is by far the most important theory in biology, the only theory that can seriously claim to unify biology. And evolution really does unify all of biology, as well as some other disciplines as well. So we bring in geology, physics, chemistry, and it unifies all of those studies together. So biological evolution, or organic evolution, really is the change in the properties of groups of organisms over the course of generations. The word evolution comes from a Latin word, evolvere, to unfold or unroll. And so this is to reveal the manifest hidden potentialities. Freeman and Heron, in their textbook, also define it as originally defined by Darwin as the descent with modification. So these are phenotypes that change over time and are inherited. So there's descendants of those characters over time. So the primary types of biological change are developmental changes, changes in the composition of ecosystems, and change between generations. And this varies from talking about multicellular organisms that can move around, those that can't move around, and unicellular organisms such as bacteria and protists. Charles Darwin, originally went to college to study medicine, but quickly decided that that wasn't for him because he fainted at the sight of blood. So when they had dissections of human bodies, he kept fainting and eventually became more interested in natural sciences, specifically geology, more so than biology at first. And so a lot of geologists consider that he's really a geologist rather than a biologist, which he was. His trip on the Beagle, which was originally slated to go only a few years but went 5 years long, he studied a lot about the geology of each of the areas where he went, South America, the tropics, and other places. And also studied the wildlife in different areas and sent skins of animals as well as plants back to England to be studied by the taxonomists of the time. So he was not a taxonomist either. So he sent back these specimens to England, including fossils as well, and then he took copious notes about the geology and the organisms, and eventually came up on the idea that these organisms were all related. And so in his notebook, he came up with this diagram here, and he wrote, I think, indicating that all of these organisms were related, going back in time. And so this is the first really phylogenetic tree or tree of life that was ever drawn. In many depictions of evolution, especially evolution of humans, you see this kind of diagram where the chimpanzee is on the left side and then the modern humans are on the right side. But this has led to some confusion. And so some people have asked, if humans evolved from gorillas, then why are there still gorillas on Earth? So it indicates that many people, while they think they have an idea of what evolution is, they have a total misunderstanding and misconception about evolution. It is not linear at all. Evolution occurs more in a branching pattern or in trees, phylogenetic trees, so that each of the branches has organisms on the ends of those, and those populations have variations within them, and then there is selection acting on some of those individuals so that some survive, some don't survive, and then you have the next generation where there is more variation, including those characters which were successful. So in this case, you see that gorillas and chimpanzees and humans all diverged or are on the same branch of the tree called the ape and gorilla branch of the tree. So instead of being linear, evolving from a gorilla, the gorillas and the chimpanzees and the humans all descended from a common ancestor in the past. So the raw materials of evolution are mutation in the DNA, or RNA in the case of some viruses, natural selection, and random genetic drift. So the first part of this is that inherited DNA changes are known as mutations, and so these mutations then can persist in a genetic line of organisms. Next, there are environmental conditions that change, both inside the organism and inside the cells, as well as outside of those organisms, and those are the ones that most people consider, but I'll be talking about both types in this class. And so that leads to natural selection. Some of those environmental conditions cause positive selection of those mutations, and others cause negative selection of those characters and mutations. Random genetic drift is the third part of sort of the equation of what's going on in evolution. These consist of mutations that have neither a positive nor a negative effect on the organism. And many years ago, it was thought that these had little effect on evolution. It's now known that they occur very often, and they have a big impact sometimes on evolution. So altogether, mutations, natural selection, and random genetic drift lead to evolutionary changes in these biological organisms. And I'll be discussing each one of these in a lot more detail in the coming weeks and lectures. First, I want to talk about something else, and that is coronavirus. So the current coronavirus that's a pandemic in the human population came as a result of being evolved from a coronavirus strain from bats and pangolins, and then existing in humans for some time. So it definitely has an evolutionary component, and I want to discuss that just a little bit here. This diagram shows the various parts of the virus. Inside you have the RNA genome, so it's a single-stranded RNA. And then surrounding that is part of the membrane that it picked up from the host, in this case human membranes. And then there are different proteins embedded in that, and specifically the one that's most important for infection is that spike glycoprotein, which interacts with cell receptors on the human cells. And then there are other proteins, the M protein, the E protein, and some of the other ones that interfere with the immune response. And those are some of the things that cause the more severe symptoms in COVID-19 disease. Here are some virions, coronavirus virions in the electron microscope, and you can see those spike glycoproteins sticking out, which interact with cell receptors on human cell membranes. Here are the life cycles of the SARS and MERS coronaviruses. They are related. SARS is the severe acute respiratory syndrome virus, and MERS is the Middle East respiratory syndrome. So SARS, I'll just talk about that mainly, attaches to the ACE2 receptors, which are angiotensin enzyme receptors. And it's enveloped by a membrane of the host cell, the host human cell. Then you get translation, replication of the RNA, and construction of the virus inside of a membrane system that comes off the Golgi in the cell. And then those eventually are released by the host cell without killing it, by the way. And then that goes on to infect other cells. One of the reasons that it causes severe pneumonia in some people is that the M and the E proteins, as well as some other factors with this virus, cause a cytokine storm. And cytokines are chemicals produced by some of the immune cells in your body. And so what it does is it causes inflammation, fever, and also release of bodily fluids. So it leads to filling the lungs with mucus and fluids, causing the pneumonia. And I should say at this point that the virus, the point of the virus replication isn't to kill anything, it's just to get itself replicated. And so in an evolutionary sense, it has evolved to get itself replicated, and it does this in bats, in other wild animals, in different mammals, including humans, and so it's evolved just to get itself replicated and to move around within different organisms. This is a representation of the genome of SARS and MERS and SARS-CoV. The current one is SARS-CoV-2. So it has some open reading frames, those ORFs on the top. Those are mainly for replication of the virus. And then some of the smaller RNAs on the end are also involved in the replication and the infection of the virus. But the S gene, which leads to that glycoprotein, the spike glycoprotein is the most important one. That has a variable region here, which is the part that interacts with the host cell receptors. And in the case of SARS, it interacts with ACE2 receptors, which are mainly on blood vessels and other muscle cells and things like that. You can also see where they differ with the MERS viruses, MERS-CoV, and you can see that primarily it's in that S gene and the S protein, the spike protein. So they do interact with different receptors. The MERS interacts with a different receptor on the host cell than to do the SARS-CoV viruses. Here's more detail about the genomes of SARS and MERS. They're quite large, around 30,000 nucleotides, which is very large for an RNA virus, and so they're complex, as you might expect. The spike protein is over there listed as S, and then these first two open reading frames encode for interferon antagonism, proteolysis, and then viral replication and transcription and viral replication. And then some of these other genes interfere with parts of the immune system and other parts of those cells. In a recent study of SARS-CoV-2, specifically looking at the spike protein, it was found when compared to other SARS viral genomes that it matched up closely with one of the bat coronaviruses, SARS coronaviruses, as well as some in pangolin. So the thought is, as happens with influenza and other viruses, that this virus had mixed at some point between bats and pangolins. And so there is a history, an evolutionary history of infecting both types of organisms. And while the virus particles were in those organisms infecting them, then there was some recombination among those genomes to create new genomes which contained characters of both of those virus histories, some in bats and some in pangolin. But then there's this piece over here which is completely unique to the CoV-2, the SARS-CoV-2, which is now the organism causing the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a piece that was not predicted to be there, and so it's indicates that it wasn't created in a lab, but it indicates that it had evolved in a human population for some time, because what that little piece does is it causes a change in the spike protein so that it will evade the human immune system for some time. So it obviously evolved within humans for some time so it could evade and become a more efficient virus infecting human cells. So then it has a very interesting evolutionary pattern. It probably started in bats, was transmitted to pangolin. There were some recombination events in pangolin that led to a new virus that had both bat characteristics of the bat virus and characteristics of the pangolin virus, and then it was transmitted either by bats or by pangolin, by eating pangolin or being exposed to the blood of pangolin. It was transmitted to humans, then evolved in a human population for some time before it became a pandemic strain that we see today. The next question is, where did it come from? In 2003, there was an unusual respiratory disease that was killing people of pneumonia symptoms in China near Hong Kong. And so that was the first outbreak of this coronavirus, a SARS-CoV, not CoV-2, but the CoV. It was suspected that this came from, originated in the live markets, where they sell live wild animals for sale for food. And so caves near where this coronavirus outbreak was occurring in Yunnan province in China, the bats were assayed for the viruses that they had, and they found some viruses that were very closely related to that SARS virus, the SARS-CoV. In the recent pandemic, the CoV-2, In early 2019, there was an unusual respiratory disease also spotted that could have been the first cases of this CoV-2, and those also are located near those caves, and many of the wild animals in the live market were obtained from areas similar to this. Also, pangolins live in the same region in Thailand and other areas of South Asia. And so the bats and the pangolins could have come in close proximity in those regions as well, causing the first CoV-2 type coronavirus. At that time, it probably could have been confused with influenza, and so there was probably not much alarm in the beginning, other than that there were more respiratory diseases than usual. However, late in 2019, it was finally recognized that this was a different disease, and it was killing a lot of people at the time. And so there was an outbreak that centered around Wuhan, although it was probably in other areas of China already. And it probably had spread to other countries as well, even into the United States by late 2019, although it was certainly under the radar at that time. Not many people were paying attention. After all, it was flu season, so they just thought that it was the flu. But by the spring of 2020, it was being picked up in many, many different countries, and it also mutated. So the variant that was in China migrated both to the Western U.S. and into Europe, and then it mutated there. And one of the mutated versions moved over into the U.S., and then some of the U.S. versions moved over into Europe. And so now we have at least 8 strains of CoV-2 circulating throughout the world, causing the pandemic that we see today. So because there are these variants and it is mutating rapidly, it could cause different symptoms and different degrees of severity and mortality, which might explain why some countries are experiencing higher rates of mortality than other countries. Because it is a new virus, that is, humans are totally susceptible to it, it's going to be around with us for quite a while until either a vaccine is developed or sufficient numbers of people have been exposed and recovered and have antibodies, and that's probably going to be 70 to 80% of the population. So it will be with us for some time. Humans are evolving an immune system to deal with it, and the viruses also are evolving to avoid the human immune system. So it is an evolutionary war. So here's a graph of the total confirmed deaths starting essentially in March, but it's clear from the question mark here that there were other cases. Probably later people will identify that it appeared much earlier than that. And the death rate continues in the world to go up, and we don't know exactly how high that number is going to be in the end. And just to be clear, this graph represents the total confirmed COVID-19 deaths. The actual number of deaths caused by this virus probably exceeds this by multiples. I'm not sure how many. Maybe it's 600,000, maybe it's 1 million by now. It's uncertain. Probably it will be years before we sort out what actually happened in this pandemic. Just by way of comparison, in the 1918 influenza A pandemic, there were about 50 million deaths total worldwide over the 2 years of the pandemic, 675,000 deaths in the U.S. And it's unclear where we are on this curve so far. Are we here, or maybe we're over here? It's uncertain where we are and how, and the number of total deaths worldwide. I think it's going to take a year or two before we know what that number actually is. In the meantime, be safe. Wash your hands frequently. Avoid touching your face. I know that's hard. I find it hard to do. Wear a mask in public and stay 6 feet away from others. This protects you, and it also protects the other people. Avoid unnecessary contact with others, and if you feel ill, stay home and away from others. If you feel really ill, talk to a doctor right away. Okay, thanks. Talk to you next time.